if you're going to have competition, the question is put, how will residents get benefits from that? Because small consumers tend to not benefit in competitive markets on their own. Secretly, they will oppose anything that reduces energy sales. And of course, any climate action reduces energy sales. The only way to reduce climate impacts is to reduce energy sales. Apart from that, you have the natural tendency in capital-intensive industries like energy, billions of dollars of investment to deliver a centralized generation to a person. And so the amount of money has to be invested in power makes those industries particularly resistant to disruption. And so they develop this idea that they should be protected and that they're a natural monopoly, and have all these sorts of terms.
Yes, today we have a super accomplished guest on the show, and it is my pleasure to introduce Paul Fenn. Paul is the president and founder of Local Power LLC based in Massachusetts, United States. He created and developed Community Choice Aggregation, CCA. We'll learn a lot about that. Paul is a national leader in renewable energy development and choice, as well as in green bonds. Paul, you are welcome to the show. Please say hello to our audience, and then we'll get started.
Okay, thank you so much for having me on your show. I admire your work and very glad to join this conversation with you. Hello, everyone.
Thank you very much, Paul. Lovely. So let's get started on the show. To our audience who may not understand, Paul, can you explain what the CCA is and how it is of practical benefit to individuals, households, and communities, right?
Yeah, CCA is an acronym for Community Choice Aggregation. And this really is a kind of community energy system that is based in state laws or regional government laws, but it's authorized by regional and state governments. But it's implemented by local municipal governments. Its mechanism is to combine the buying power of a whole community of energy into a propulsive program whose goal is to decarbonize supply, to localize supply, to transfer a bit of the ownership over to the users of the energy, to change the business model of energy through this aggregation mechanism and under local democratic governance. In other words, through city councils and town boards, which pass local laws to define the programs and themselves control through local votes who are going to be the companies who provide the redefined energy services.
So it appears that there is a political dimension to it. You mentioned laws, implementation by municipalities. How is that shaping up with respect to how the businesses, especially those in big power players, are receiving this? Do you see, has there been any conflict? Has there been a smooth operationalization of the laws? Because I think that this would be some kind of incursion, into the territory of big businesses involved in energy.
It can be. In some places it has been. Currently, CCA has been in play in the United States for 30 years now, and it's been adopted in about half of the energy market in terms of population energy use, and so it has rapidly, consistently grown. In some places, there has been opposition or resistance by the incumbent electric utility, which in some places has regarded the aggregation as a commercial threat. In most places, the laws are adopted in the context of electric industry restructuring, under which competition is being introduced, as I understand it, in recently in Nigeria. And so within the context of these pro-competition measures, the CCA provision that allows for local community aggregation and buying of energy is really a sort of a subset. It's not adopted in a vacuum, but as a subset. If you're going to have competition, the question is put: how will residents get benefits from that? Because small consumers tend to not benefit in competitive markets on their own. Small businesses, how will they benefit? They tend not to benefit. Deregulation tends to benefit the largest buyers of energy. So factories and chain stores and governments that have very large energy use will tend to get discounts, and smaller users will tend not to. And so the aggregation is adopted in the mix of those policies, and has really won in the U.S. has really won acceptance just because it's the only mechanism that has delivered benefits to the vast majority. I'm talking about 90% of energy consumers who would not benefit under a simple deregulation regime. So there's resistance from the incumbents, but most of the resistance that has occurred has more to do with resistance to decarbonization, to localization, in other words, measures that are adopted by those aggregations to reduce pollution, to reduce energy use, because that's what really affects them. The utilities, in most cases, owning power transmission systems, won't admit that they don't like reduced energy use. They won't admit that, but they do. And so secretly, they will oppose anything that reduces energy sales. And of course, any climate action reduces energy sales. The only way to reduce climate impacts is to reduce energy sales. And so they're in this conflict of interest. And it's really the main resistance from utilities has come where those communities have been more determined upon real change as opposed to just market participation, right? Which is trying to get a discount, trying to get a better deal, and all these aggregations do typically provide lower electricity bills for consumers. So many of the aggregations are looking to lower how much people have to pay for electricity. They don't mind that. But if your goal is to green the supply, to change things physically, then you can get resistance to that.
I asked this question because, I was reading up, and what I see is that there's a report by Bloomberg, which has described, the resistance as a big threat, to the CCA, and that resistance cuts across the power value chain. And now you talk about democratization of power in the power sector, giving power to localities, to municipalities in terms of control of the energy that they consume. And that's, of course, that's upsetting the market, so to speak, So how is that, this conflict, as it were, between, localization of power, and the centralization, I hope I'm using the right phrases, of, market forces, how does that leave, the replication of the CCA, especially across, a national scale, in the context of what the United States is currently?
That's a good question. Okay. The CCA has been described as a threat to the utility, certainly. Or it's been speculated that in that Bloomberg piece that I'm public enemy number one to the utilities. There has been some of that kind of fighting. But the truth is that, particularly with electric restructuring, you have a transition from a totally centralized industry in which one entity owns the local network, the long distance transmission lines, and the power plants, vertically integrated entities prior to electric industry restructuring, which has occurred in much of the world in the past 30 years, not just the United States, Europe, Africa, Asia. A lot of countries have effectively deregulated, which is to essentially break those vertically integrated industries into um, niche markets, in effect. You still have the incumbents who own the distribution networks and own sometimes also transmit high voltage transmission lines. Usually, in most cases, they no longer own the generation. So already you have a separation from the wires companies and the generator companies. But then you also have emerging technologies, and these have made giant leaps in the past 20 years. I mean, 20 years ago, solar panels were $7 a watt. Today, you can buy them for 30 cents a watt. Okay, so crazy how cheap solar is. But you also have a reduction in battery costs, battery technology, diversification of battery technology. You have control systems, software, apps, phone-based apps where you can control devices, appliance devices, electric vehicles, with bidirectional chargers. You have a lot of, I would say, tipping point technologies that are already in the market, largely coming in from other industries like computers and phones, right? These are really the sources of these technologies in many ways. The battery technologies, particularly, and the control system technologies are not coming from energy; they're coming into energy from other industries. So you have the market broadly speaking, and then you have the former monopolies, which are these incumbents, the ones that are, quote, threatened, are already isolated by the fact that they're, number one, antiquated. Their assets are a century old or older. Uh, they have done very little to modernize, partly because they were monopolies, and so they have erected walls around themselves, regulatory walls that protected them for 100 years against competition. But that those walls have largely been breached now, or just blown away, and they are now exposed to multiple so-called threats. Now, in a market, a competitor is not technically a threat, right? A market is supposed to be fair game competition, not warfare. But large corporate entities that hold incumbent monopoly positions develop a culture of entitlement where they regard market competition from market forces as threats. In other words, which can be legitimately subverted deliberately, blocked. So in essence, it's the network owners and the transmission owners that constitute the main barriers to market activities. Apart from that, you have the natural tendency in capital intensive industries like energy, where you need a lot of money to serve one person with electricity from the grid. You need, billions of dollars of investment to deliver a centralized generation to a person. And so the amount of money has to be invested in power makes those industries particularly resistant to disruption. And so they develop this idea that that they should be protected and that they're a natural monopoly, and you have all these sorts of terms. But also when you deregulate them, because they remain capital intensive in many ways, they also tend to form cartels. That's price fixing, informal networks of price fixing. And see, the markets have a greater tendency to fail compared to something like, for example, a cellular telephone industry in which you can serve 100,000 people with maybe $100 million of investment. You would need billions of dollars of investment to serve 100,000 people with electricity. And so you get more easily get competition in less capital intensive industries than you get in high capital intensive industries, where you have a high degree of anti-competitive activity among the market participants. So the trick in terms of regulatory theory, if you want to call it that, how do you get competition to successfully occur? How do you get so-called market forces to prevail in capital intensive industries like energy? And my experience has been consistently that CCA, that is the participation of communities, aggregation, the organization of demand, so you have supply and demand, and the organization of demand improves the conditions for competition because it organizes the market into longer term contracts that support orderly investment. And that's the real challenge. How do you get in a market that requires huge amounts of capital to serve someone, how do you develop a basis for investing in an energy transition, for example, if each consumer can change their supplier on a whim? There's no long-term basis to make an investment. Everything's very uncertain, very volatile, minute by minute, day by day. And you need year by year, decade by decade to make a power plant investment. Now, with solar panels, you can make an investment in 10 years, but it's a 10-year investment. You get paybacks, you get return on investment several years into the operation of a solar panel. But you don't get it right away. You don't get it in 2 weeks, you know. And so CCA, these municipalities really have brought order to markets that were otherwise very disorderly and tended toward cartels, price fixing, and toward anti-competitive behavior by incumbents. So it's helped to, in a way, to rally the pro-competitive forces in the economy. Those are the solar industry, all the technology industries, the financial entities that want to back those investments. They've all rallied together to become the new providers of the CCAs, and they became very rapidly very large, and so as large as the utilities. And so because the CCAs brought this order to the market, which is, let's have 1 million people aggregate together, you know, in a city, an urban area, or 100,000 or 50,000 people compared to one person, an isolated person. And that has really intensified the pro-competitive forces. So I think in a way, there's kind of like a myth of the market versus the government. And the central government does have that sort of anti-competitive monopolistic effect, but local government introduces, I would say, constructive order/disorder into the market, which is that no one can dominate it, right? There's this city over here, there's this town over there. Who's going to get that town? Who's going to get that city? It creates a viable playing board for investment-based entities to be able to focus on a target and work on that target for years at a time, versus just basket cases that are marketing products in a vacuum, which is what you get with deregulation, or monopolies that are just locking and loading and holding everyone captive to whatever they do for multiple decades at a time. So it's kind of a middle zone. You know, it creates a middle world of real life competition, of like street competition, as opposed to corporate casino kind of finance capital competition, which is what you have otherwise.
But that's where policy comes in, I suppose, right? Especially at the national level, where, you know, the concerns and fears of, you know, the incumbents that you call them, you know, can be addressed. Because I mean, if a business sees the value that there is profits to be made in decarbonizing, in transitioning, you know, from traditional, you know, industries to, you know, renewables, cleaner energy, why would they not? You know, but there's need for that assurance, like you have just said. I mean, it's not a whim. It's not a dash. It's probably a marathon. It's going to take time. It's going to take years. And there are concerns about asset stranding and all of that, you know, and the loss of all of that, sudden loss of all of that monopoly and power. It can be addressed by policy, by governments, maybe at the central level. So, I mean, the organization of demand at municipalities and localities can also match some form of, you know, reorganization and repurposing, you know, of that supply chain by a centralized, you know, policy making, you know, model. Why is that not happening? And I mean, why can't that not happen like in the United States? Why?
Well, it's a fascinating, super important question about economic theory that you raise. And I think it concerns in a way, several hundred-year-old conception of government that comes from the Republican revolutions that started all over the world after the French Revolution in the early 19th century. And this was this idea of the nation state as a republic. And so we put all of this kind of hope, aspirational idealism into these central governments, and we can reconceive of ourselves as being uniform populations within the territories of those governments. We sort of reinvented ourselves. I say we, I mean all humanity. That prior to that time, humanity was much more identified with the town, with the region, They had special dialects, local dialects. There's a natural tendency toward local organization of life, and these republics erected a very artificial, very forced concept of national identity that has never really worked, uh, because it's false. It's not true. And the problem with the national governments, and I deal with this a lot because I deal with states and I get these laws passed to allow the local activity, and none of them have the same response, was we can do this, we can regulate this, we'll protect the consumer. Why give it to these little towns and cities, corrupt mayors, and it's just dirty, it's filthy, it won't work. What they don't understand is that, yes, there's corruption at the local level in different places. Of course there is. But you can't compare that to the level of corruption on K Street in Washington, D.C., which is 20 buildings filled with maybe a couple thousand people who lobby the Congress and control that government. They control it intellectually. They corrupt it with their money. It's systematic gaslighting of the entire process. The centralization of power in that massive way is inherently destructive and tends toward manipulation. I mean, speaking of a lack of competition and a monopolization, it is a political monopoly, and it takes power away from the local and the regional, and effectively makes it impossible to do things. And all ideas go to die there, similar to the idea of democracy goes to die in these republics, because democracy can work at the local level, because people can actually walk to the building where the discussions are happening. They can not just go outside and protest, they can go in and participate in the meetings. They can run for local office. They don't need millions of dollars to be able to win, to become a U.S. senator. They can run on no money and win. And so you have an organic basis there for democracy, and I would say that is attended by an organic basis for real competition. The idea that Washington, D.C., or any capital of a great, huge country, it's just impossible. And so what you get when those large mega states attempt to create this kind of power, what they call monopsony power, which is a monopoly buyer power. Let the state of California try to become, during its energy crisis 25 years ago, the single buyer of power for the state. It was a catastrophe because it caused collusion. There was one buyer, and they thought, oh, well, if there's one buyer, that's, all this market power, we can get the best price from supplier. No, because all the suppliers are focusing on one deal. So they can collude, and they do collude, and they fix the prices and drive them up. So it actually caused a massive loss to the state's wealth. The state of California, this is back in 2000 during the energy crisis, when the state tried to do that. If you compare that to the CCA, these aggregations, it broke the state up into 25 entities, each with its own independent market, going out and asking for bids from companies to provide services. And so the suppliers can't collude anymore. They have to decide, where are you going to bid? Where are you going to focus your business development activities? Where are you going to put your intellectual capital and put actual capital into submitting bids? Because it costs a lot of money to submit these bids, prepare the bids. So that's real competition. It's not like theoretical competition. It's a degree of chaos, right, that's needed. You need order, structure in terms of you're making longer term decisions compared to an individual consumer in an open, deregulated market, but also a more disorder than you would have with these centralized government entities. And so it's kind of a middle zone. And I think the middle zone is where real things, more honest, enduring, coherent human activity can take place.
I'm trying to resist the temptation to keep you on this lane of the theory of governments and the interplay of governments and market forces, and because the question can also arise, if you say this, the central government, is in bed and it's not representing the localities and municipalities, it can also be said of the municipalities. At some point, they also get corrupted. They also get to be derailed, by big money, by power, and all of that. But let me not drag this conversation along that line. Let me ask you just before we go on a short break, Paul, in terms of the real value to households, to consumers, to communities, what does the CCA offer in terms of sustainability? Can you break that down for everyone, to understand, as a family, as an individual, as communities? What is that real value, tangible or intangible, that makes CCA the way to go?
Thank you. I think that the best way to put this is that in straight markets, where it's just there's no real structure and there just are corporate entities producing products and offer them to individuals, going green means paying more. De facto, green is a premium product. That is a systemic barrier to energy transition in the world, because it means that only a minority, in most countries, a small minority of the population, can afford to support an energy transition. And so the real challenge and the real success of this policy of CCA is that it through the aggregation first, it lowered the price of the service. If you buy together with other people, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of other people, that your combined purchasing power will deliver you better terms than you'll get alone. So that right there is step one. Step two, as you mentioned earlier, was green bonds. So I wrote a green bond authority and built it into this model. The model's been under development now for 30 years, and this is 20 years ago I developed the green bond. And so that a green bond is a municipal debt instrument that is issued to borrow money at a low rate of interest in order to finance new local renewable energy facilities, energy efficiency measures in homes, and so on. So this is a second layer of savings, because you're aggregating, lower the cost of buying energy, and then you're using green bonds to lower the capital cost of investments, because renewable energy is 100% capital intensive. There's no fuel element in the cost of renewable energy. It's all based on equipment, and therefore the capital that was needed to install that equipment. The rate of interest has a dramatic effect on the cost of the renewable energy that comes out. And so that both of those factors really reduced the cost. So when we say CCA, we really mean CCA and green bonds that have enabled anyone to go green in their energy use without having to pay more. And that is what makes it important, apart from all the other theories we've been talking about.
Right.
That it means that everyone can do this without paying more. And that means that an energy transition is possible. Not just that it's just and equitable, but that it's feasible. And it simply is not feasible otherwise. So that's really is the kind of the paradigm of CCA, the primary paradigm. And there are other details we can get into, other improvements that my company has introduced into the model in more recent years. But those are the really elemental steps that made CCA grow really fast and become big quickly in the United States.
Well, I mean, to bait you further on this path of train of thought is to probably add that CCA gives power to the people. It brings power that ordinarily resides with, the big corporations, the incumbents. It democratizes that power and makes the people feel powerful. I hope I'm right, yeah, so I'll come back. There's a fascinating question I want to ask about how this relates to carbon credits. You mentioned green bonds. I understand that bit, but carbon credits, carbon offsetting, is there some correlation? But there's something that we do at on this show, the Sustainable Podcast. We have a collection of data sets that we put out, and we usually like our guests to speak to it. So for this one, I would play this short audio. It will also pop up on the screen, if you don't mind, for a minute, and then less than a minute, really. Then you may speak to it if you'd like to.
Sustainable data died. From just over 2 million units in 2018, electric vehicle sales have surged to more than 17 million in 2024. That's a leap from just 2.2% of global car sales to over 20% in just 6 years. In 2023 alone, over 14 million EVs were sold, making up 18% of all cars sold worldwide. This isn't just growth, it's a transformation, and the momentum is only building. By 2030, electric vehicles are projected to account for nearly 30% of all new car sales globally. This dramatic rise signals more than changing consumer habits. It reflects a global shift toward cleaner, more sustainable transportation. The message is clear: the EV revolution isn't coming. It's already here.
So why is it easy? I don't know if that's the word to use. You see from this data that auto manufacturers are moving, they're following the train. What is the incentive? Why are they able to do that? And it doesn't seem to be the case with the energy, the power sector, in addition to whatever thoughts you have on that selection of data we just provided.
It's actually, it's a really good question. Okay, the main difference, I would say, the reason that the auto industry has made the change is that the purchase of an automobile is strictly a consumer choice. That consumers are habituated to buy vehicles. In the U.S., I think the average American buys a vehicle every 4 years or something like that, which I find shocking, but it is true. And so there's this sort of, if you want to call it a culture, that people buy cars, and it's a major investment. It's also the automobile industry really made this happen, at least in the U.S., through the extension of consumer credit. So people buy cars on credit; they don't buy it out of cash out of their pockets. Now, who is buying their electricity on credit? Right, that was part of the idea of the green bond, was to introduce debt, in this case, low interest debt, into the equation, because obviously people are paying their monthly bill for energy throughout their lives. And for those who are low income, the vast majority of people, that is the major capital that they will spend in their lives, energy. So their wealth is squandered on energy. Everyone is basically pissing away their wealth on vehicle fuel, on electricity, on heating fuel. And you could say one works in order to afford energy in that respect, and at least in the modern world. And so is this not, this capital, is this not the natural wealth of the society? And if this capital could be devoted to an investment, would that not be a means of extending wealth in a way that is both sustainable and not dependent on a system of welfare or subsidies? That if you could provide the structure for people to redefine their, what I would call, energy rent payments as investment capital. Renewable energy presents this opportunity because it does not require fuel. And so if you can buy the equipment, it makes your energy, and you're not paying for fuel anymore. And so anyway, that's the insight, right? And the compared to the electricity industry, of course, it's not a consumer market. It is also grid power is not uh, easy to market as a consumer product because it's generic. All electricity is the same, right? Companies that sell green power are on deregulated markets are not really selling green power. All right, I mean they're just selling power that's been remarketed from the grid. It's like a bizarre fantasy that that you could um, market grid electricity as green. It's really pretty bizarre. I think it's actually a form of public madness to even suggest such a thing, and yet it's exactly what's been done as one of the structures that have been used apart from greenwashing is the use of certificates, renewable energy certificates, to facilitate renewable energy and incentivize renewable energy in deregulated markets. And it just really has not worked very well because of the high incidence of fraud, and it's very confusing. So it's just difficult when you have a monopoly owning the wires and cartels, tendencies, I mean, companies that are tending toward cartels that own the power plants, and then middlemen, usually finance entities, that are the ones who are buying from the generators and purchasing renewable energy certificates, and then going before state regulators and receiving authorization to market the electricity that they're reselling as renewable energy. This is a farce. From the point of view of a real change in energy, this is like a drug-induced coma, and does not produce the desired result. The theory of that it has an incentive effect on the market to incentivize investment in renewables, totally theoretical, completely speculative, and has not produced that result. We've had these sorts of schemes in effect in the United States for 30 years, and the results have been tepid at best. So there's a need to, like the electric vehicle, to get to the point where you have what I like to call a reification, where you can actually think of a real thing that is renewable energy. What is that real thing, and how do you get it? And we need some equivalent of what you had with vehicles, which is the low interest or zero interest loan, some facilitation, but also not a single technology, right? One of the problems with consumer products is that they are incomplete, right? So if someone comes to your house and says, "I want to sell you a solar panel, you should go solar." Well, on its own, solar panels don't really do very much. I mean, they're very limited. They work 5 hours a day. So if that's all you're getting, then you still need the grid for 19 hours a day. And so then you have to have a grid arrangement to take your power, and all these sort of confusing transactive relationships. How do you present a technology that's more holistic, that actually provides more of what you need? That would mean multiple technologies, right? That would mean the solar panels, but also a battery, and they need to work together. They shouldn't be two different companies. It should be one company. And by the way, the vehicle, the one of the dramatic omissions of the electric vehicle industry, while it's growing rapidly, is the very slow adoption of bidirectional charging on electric vehicles. Very slow. It's really just Nissan that tried to lead that, and they've been soundly, I would say, punished for trying to lead, because the rest of the industry would not do it. They're still not doing it. Even Tesla doesn't do it. They're selling Tesla walls that have bidirectional capability, but their cars don't. Why is that, right? They're all, to a certain extent, involved in market segmentation and anti-competitive behavior. So trying to control different sectors, deliberately not innovating within those sectors, and try in order to profit from them. And so you have a degree of anti-competitive behavior in any industry, a very high degree in electricity or in energy. And therefore, there needs to be facilitation to provide the structure at the local democratic level to to ensure enough order to the market, a regional order, I would say, so that there is a basis for the private sector to do the engineering work, which is what my company does, to combine these systems into packages like an electric vehicle with the photovoltaic array, a solar array, with a new heating and hot water and cooling system that works with the solar, and the three pieces are interoperable so that you don't need the grid maybe a couple hours a day. The rest of it's all handled with your equipment. Now, if you can do that, then you're not buying power from the grid for 22 hours a day.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And that is saved money, not just avoided energy. So now you're saving money, and you're not saving it just because you're buying it more cheaply, the aggregation, not just because you're spending less on interest payments, the green bonds, but also because you've built equipment in such a way that you don't hardly ever need to buy energy. And that's wealth. That is how you get long-term accumulation of wealth, where you don't need cash to function like you did before. That's economic independence. So my view is that's a leap. You could see the leap where you're no longer just a little bit cheaper, a little discount, a little bit greener, all this kind of marginal improvement where you never quite arrive at a real change. Now we're talking about a real change where you have done something at one end, you come out the other end, and your life is different. That's what I'm really, from my point of view, that's where we've got to go. That time's up on incrementalism, and we just need to accept that this kind of mediation is necessary. And even with, as you raised, there is corruption at all levels of government, and it's unavoidable. But there is a genuine dialectic at the local level where it can be corrected, where it can, there's recourse. There is no recourse to corruption at the highest level. There's no way out. I mean, the way the United States is right now, there is no escape. There's no authority that can come in and fix the situation. We're locked into essentially a terminal, multi-decade problem. That's what's going on. But a municipality, it's a couple of years, mayor's in jail. You know what I mean? It's like, you can fit, you can fix, you can punish, there's consequences. We've not had a single national official go to jail. All the things the U.S. government's done in the last 25 years, no one has gone to jail. No one. We have our officials that started the Iraq and Afghanistan war who are honored as statesmen, right? Not only are they not punished, they're honored. And so that degree of corruption, that's what I'm talking about, that where there's no higher official to swoop down and bust everybody. Like the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, routinely comes in and busts mayors, puts them in handcuffs, drags them off. It just happened in my hometown of Oakland. The mayor is busted. She's in court. She's thrown out of office. There's a new mayor. So yeah, the new mayor might also end up being corrupt, but at least there's dialectic. At least there's the possibility of democracy there.
Which is absent at the central level, which probably needs a hard reset for anything probably to happen. But that appears to be far-fetched, Paul, because the current situation in the United States, gives really great cause for concern. I mean, I'm talking about Trump 2.0, where we've seen reversals of all the gains that have been made, climate action, and where does this all leave? What are your thoughts? Are you really, really bored at what's the extent of your concern about what Trump is doing and the reverberations, not just in the United States, but across the world, and all of this, is likely to roll back many, 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 gains that have been made?
Oh, it's true. No, he's doing outrageous things. He's eliminating regulation of fossil power plants. He's fast tracking nuclear power plant permits. He's declaring climate change to be a hoax. I think for Americans, we've been going through this kind of political whiplash since the end of the Cold War. Up to the Cold War, there was essentially a corporatist state, anti-communist. Democrats and Republicans really didn't debate at all. And it was just U.S. empire, Once the wall came down, that changed. And we started to get the pattern that we have now, which is that the Democratic Party moved to the right, became pro-Wall Street Party. The Republican Party moved further right and became essentially, I like to call them Taliban. They became cultural reactionaries who defy everything. And so you have this essentially the end of liberalism. There had been a kind of liberalism under the Cold War. Leftism had been suppressed in the 1920s in America, in the U.S. When a presidential candidate was imprisoned during his presidential campaign, a socialist. And so you have a very long tradition of the suppression of the left. Then you had the kind of Cold War liberal, which really disappeared under Bill Clinton. And then we got George Bush Jr. George Bush Jr. should be regarded as essentially the crisis of the U.S. state because he violated everything, right? He put everyone under surveillance. He created the spy state. He started endless wars based on fabrications. He authorized the use of torture. It's just the list is too long. I'm sure you're familiar with all of this. But he basically destroyed every standard that we had as a national political culture. And ever since George Bush Jr., the United States has just been completely incoherent. And that's the truth of the matter. So my point of view is Trump is the clown that they let in the room at the end of this process. But it's not as though things were going very well under any of the preceding administrations. It was just different shades of hypocrisy, different shades of active destruction. But never an instance, except for the brief hope of Bernie Sanders that there would be any interruption of this process. There's hardly a flicker of hope during over a quarter century of national history. So my view is that that's partly how I arrived at my own view about central states. That I really think this goes beyond. I think you've seen now a great deal of evidence of this in Europe. I mean, Europe is in many ways kind of gone Trump, right? It's the world is
an amazing speed. Yeah, I mean,
it's extraordinary. Yeah, it's like a psychosis. It's the psychosis of the state. Terrifying. But I think at the same time, I take it back to the French Revolution. I take it back to these national republics. Have they ever really worked? When? Like, what are we talking about? I really think I guess this is something of a radical view, but it seems to me that once colonization ended, this began. That there's never been much of an intermission between those two states, either colonial war, the global contest for supremacy, or then the Cold War, which turned it into an ideological dispute between communism and capitalism. And then ever since that ended, it's been what we have now, which is incoherent strands of ideas, whiplash, political whiplash between elections, utter discontinuity of policy. It's dysfunctional and spasmodic. And so from my point of view, I look at it and think the real lesson we have to take from Trump is that this is not our democracy, that the national governments are at best guarantors of defense, I suppose, but they're not the place we should be placing our hope. They're not the arena of constructive action, progressive action. We can't place our hope there. It doesn't deserve that hope. That we need to wean ourselves from this idea of national republics. Not that I'm saying we should get rid of them or that we should revolt against them. I don't think there's any point. The main thing is we should stop watching TV and pretending that those clowns are in charge, because they aren't. And the problem is that because we watch them, we aren't either. We're not really paying attention to the worlds we live in anymore. And we're ignoring our own communities, and we're ignoring the decisions that we could be making locally, with them having to bring, like when I have to go get the states to authorize what I'm doing, it's not that I ignore them. I have to go there and get permission. But I don't go there hoping for any help. And whenever they try to help me, I say, no thanks. I don't want your help. I don't believe in you. I just want permission, and I'm going to go back to the town here, and we're going to do it here. And for me, that's how I think it through. That's, for me, Trump is a lesson that the king has no clothes. That we should not believe in this. It is sort of like the Renaissance Pope, when under Luther and Calvin and the various English Protestants who just became disillusioned and realizing the Vatican is not what we thought it was. And this doesn't work for us anymore. It isn't just that we want a better pope. We're sick of talking about who should be the next pope. We're done. And so let's just localize this. And there was more revolt in that. Again, I'm not calling for revolt. I just think it's like we need to refocus where life actually exists, because our attention's been drawn away, and we just don't pay attention to our actual lives anymore, and to giving any importance to the local. We've kind of degraded ourselves in a way because we just watch. I think we've kind of been perverted by all this, that it's in a way that the states, the national republics, took on this churchly kind of cultural power where we give them all this importance. We think they're so important, and we fetishize them and watch them. And so people know more about, Donald Trump and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris than they do about anyone in their lives. And they sit around like talking about, Trump said this, Trump said that, Biden said this, he did that. Who cares? I mean, this is, I don't know. I think we've been sort of really alienated from ourselves politically. And that's a big part of the problem, is that it's cultural and doesn't work. And we need to learn from Trump. That not wait for the next Democratic candidate. It's going to be very depressing. I have no doubt. It won't be any better. It'll just be another one of their stooges, and they'll keep controlling the elections. And, I'm already almost 60 years old. I'm thinking, I'm sick of this. I'm not waiting anymore. I feel like a chump.
And taking power back to the people appears to be, something that is, real, unlike the unreal world that you have been talking about in the last couple of minutes, which is, very depressing, to say the least. And it doesn't look like, and it's not just the United States, everywhere else. You mentioned, the replications across Europe, and all of that. So it's really depressing. But let's come back to, the bright side of CCA and the great work that you are doing, Paul. How that is empowering local communities, making people, get to see themselves more, talk about themselves more, about communities more, and the question is, what is the correlation between the CCA, green bonds, carbon credits, carbon, offsets, and all of that? I ask this in terms of the global ecosystem of, the use of carbon offsets to greenwash, and that's another question I'm going to ask in a bit. But how does CCA fit into this ecosystem of green bonds, carbon credits, and offsets?
You have the best questions. That's amazing. I got started because I had a professor in graduate school, University of Chicago, who got the Nobel Prize for creating the carbon credit trading system. And when I met him, his name was Ronald Coase, and he wrote a famous paper called The Nature of the Firm back in the 1950s, which basically said pollution, it's free to pollute. And so unless corporations are charged money to pollute, they'll keep polluting and they'll keep subverting regulation. And this became a popular idea in states, and so it gave birth to carbon credit, emissions credit trading systems, which started right at the time I was in Chicago. They started at the Chicago Board of Trade. They were just beginning. And so I was, I guess I was 25 years old and a PhD student. And he was, I heard about him. I read his paper and I found it so dark that I contacted him and started some dialogues with him. And he was the one who encouraged me, actually, because he had ended up no longer believing his own theory. But he said he felt he'd been captured by Milton Friedman in the Chicago School of Economics, and he was sort of trapped in this role as one of their mascots because it's a neoliberal thing. Carbon credit trading is a neoliberal idea. It says you shouldn't use government to address climate change. You should create new markets for carbon, and that will solve the problem. Of course, I read that and thought, that's pretty funny. You have markets that are totally out of control to the extent that it's destroying the earth, and your answer is to create more markets. I feel like it's a Dr. Seuss book or something. It was like some kind of joke. So I called him thinking I would just make fun of him. It was almost a crank call. I was just going to make fun of the guy. But he agreed with me. So he struck it up and he said, well, if you really want to get involved in this, you should get involved in electric industry restructuring because it's being exported by Margaret Thatcher's government in the United Kingdom through Reagan and Clinton, who are really very similar in this way, into the United States. And it's going to be really the big, he called it the jihad, the holy war of the neoliberals. If they can deregulate energy, then the whole economy will sort of follow because the whole economy runs on energy. So it's the center of the economy. And so that's what got my attention. And really, CCA, community choice aggregation, was an idea that I put together thinking of it as an alternative to carbon trading as a climate solution. Like, okay, if carbon trading is one way to, in theory, to do it, but isn't there any other way to do this? That's how I started. Really, carbon trading is no way to do it. As Ronald Coase said at the time, he compared carbon trading to the Russian stock market, and this is in 1992, right after, right as the Russian economy was being liberalized and the Russian stock market was super volatile. He said you don't have enforceability of contracts, and so there's too much fraud. You can't have trading when there's no way to know what actually happened. And so you have enormous amounts of fraud in carbon trading, and effectively, as you say, it is a major cause or weapon of greenwashing, because you have so many different schemes. You have trading across thousands of miles of jurisdiction across the whole world, right? With the tree growing initiatives, which have been such a huge problem, where you plant a tree and you claim its life cycle carbon impact, and then you monetize that tree. But is it alive in 2 years? Right? And they find, in fact, no, it's dead. No one watered the trees. So some entity plants, 10,000, 100,000 trees, and then they just leave and claim the credits and sell them to someone else. So you just have insane amounts of fraud. And it's just stupid. It's stupid because we should recognize that the ecological crises of our time, not just climate change, but many, are the result of markets gone bad. And it's not the result of government regulation. Right? Government regulation didn't cause climate change. It didn't cause mass extinction, didn't cause a mass drug addiction, or any number of the so-called parts of the poly crisis. It's markets, and market power within markets, not the idealized market of small competitive actors, competing and innovating. No, real markets, which is giant concentrated entities that are cannibalistic and destructive, and that not only harm ecology and economies, but also attack governments and subvert and corrupt them in order to continue their activity. So a kind of war. within that so-called market. And so to recognize that there's a crisis of the market, it's not just simply a good thing. It's not. It's not a good thing at all. But on the other hand, we need another idea that if we just go back to the old idea of, let the government control everything. Well, look at the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union did massive amounts of ecological damage. It wasn't just capitalism that caused that. So these models don't work. What they share in common is that they're overconcentrated. And so they like to make up things like carbon trading because they really don't change anything. They just pretend to. And so CCA says, okay, how about if we just start over and figure out how to do this for real? If we actually wanted to, because it's like, I think we get swept ideological, and it's almost like a theological impulse to believe in these very abstract ideas like the market and the national republic and all this stuff, democracy in the abstract. What is it really? And if we were going to okay, we have to actually do it now. We're in a boat. We're running out of food. We have one paddle. How are we going to get back to shore? And if you do that mentally, in my view, you immediately go to, well, let's just do it. Meaning whoever I am, wherever I live, with my neighbors, with my town, let's go. Because we can do that. We can act in a meaningful way where there's continuity and memory. But when it's like, let's create a new system, right? That's one of the idols of the national republics from the Enlightenment and in the 18th century. Systems, the idea that there's a system and that the Constitution, if we have the right Constitution, the right system, the carbon trading system, or some other system, that would just solve the problem and automatically solve itself. What if it won't? What if no system will solve anything? Right. So in that case, it's like, no, how do we just do stuff? And so CCA is a more direct action through local democracy. It's not direct action in the sense of individuals acting alone, but it's direct action in the collective. At the same time that it's not anti-market, it uses companies to implement all the programs, competitive solicitations, right? So it isn't like anti-market. It doesn't fall into the Cold War theological dispute about government versus market. It just says, wait, no, we want middle ground. We want to have use markets, but we need to have power in those markets. And we want to use capital, but we don't want to just depend on Goldman Sachs and billionaires. They end up always taking all the value out. So we need to have our own finance. We need to have our own aggregation, draw the lines between human need and supply and the private sector, a clearer relationship, more articulated relationship, complex relationship, organized, thoughtful, preconceived, structured relationship to market participants so we can get the benefits we want. And there's no question about it. It's not some theory that you're going to give it to me in 30 years. No, you're giving it to me starting right now. And it's going to come every month and I'm going to see it on a ledger. And if you don't, I'm firing you and getting someone else to continue where you left off. And we're doing it now, we're not talking about it. I really think it's a shift from this ideological approach to human problems into a much more practical approach, which means so-called we, people, wherever we are, we have to do it, and we have to use our local governments to do it. And if we did that, then there would be, I think, credibility for nation states that really view local governments as just complainers, as what do they call them, Mau-Maus. They need something. They always need something. They have needs, you give them. They have needs, you give them. And children, they view us as children. And we need to build credibility. And really the CCA's built this credibility. Like in California, when it started, the state was very skeptical. The legislature passed it, but the regulators didn't like it. But today, the CCA's there. I said it's 25 entities. It's like 250 municipalities, 15 million people. And they have built, they've issued $15 billion in green bonds, and they've attracted $20 billion in equity capital. So they built $35 billion of renewables in about 5 years. They're the largest issuers of green bonds in America, larger than China. They are the top 10 renewable energy users above state minimums, and they they have 10 times the customers of the next 10 on the national list, national renewable energy. They have blown up the national list. They've blown up the state list. So now the regulators are going, wow, like these people know what they're doing. And so it changes the attitude of the state toward the municipalities. They no longer view them as children. Now they're kind of backing away and saying, oh, well, how do we help you? In the past, they were saying, we can do it better than you. You're just going to screw it up. You don't know what you're doing. So it's like growing up, that with the parent or something, where we have to command their respect, and we command their respect by being less of a voyeur and just watching who's this next celebrity, who's the next governor, who's and just being more involved in doing things and with our communities, and wanting to be involved in also in the business of it, right? Having local businesses make a living off of it, and as in a local economy, not just as a save the world or kind of idealism, but no, as we need to build economies that are real and that are enduring and that don't change their mind every 2 or 4 years whenever there's an election and reverse everything that was done the last election. Cities don't do that. When cities start doing something, they keep going. They might alter it a bit, but they don't just say, no, we're undoing everything that the last mayor did. Not doing any of that anymore. They can't afford it. They're making investments. They're managing infrastructure. They don't just play around with the national economy like it's a game, which is exactly what our presidents do. Just torching everything that's being done. Bankrupting companies like Trump is doing with the wind industry. Just bankrupting them. They're building wind farms off the coast. He just bankrupted all these companies. Just like that. He doesn't care a whim. That doesn't happen in cities. They might have corruption on and off, but they don't torch everything like that. It really is an imperial mentality, and it's sort of theological. It just says
the people are closer to them. I mean, the people can buy, sooner than later on, at the central level. It's such a great success the way you say it about the CCA. Massive adoption. Over half of the United States. You said, How do we move this, beyond the United States to other jurisdictions? Have you tried this? Has there been a challenge? Has there been any form of pushback? This is something that really needs to go across the world. What's holding back, Paul?
Well, I have not tried, mostly because I really believe in localism. So anyone who's interested, I would love to help. But I don't have a kind of ambition like I want to enter someone's country and convert them to my. That's exactly what I'm sort of against. It's like I don't like that. And for me, I'm from here, so I'm doing it here. I'm trying to demonstrate it, prove it, like fix it, make it good. I keep working on it. Okay, we've been changing it. I think I mentioned to you we have a new version of CCA that we're working on now in New York, after California, which was the second version, and. So I feel like I'm our research and development guy. That's what I'm doing. I'm trying to make this work, to test everything out, fail over and over again, succeed, define what works, what doesn't work, and then refine it and then publish it and talk about it. But I'll help anyone who wants to do it. I have received calls from the European Commission. We have been subject to subjects of a bunch of European Commission studies and things like that. Looking at it, I have heard that there's some kind of CCA going on in India. They never called me. I don't know. And I've heard that there's even something like it in China. But again, I've never heard from them. I don't really know. I just read an article somewhere, never really looked it up. So I think there's a lot of interest in it because it has had real impact. It has really worked well. There've been a lot of Cambridge University studies and European studies looking at the case study of CCA, particularly in California. But no, I have not tried to export the policy, and I haven't seen it happen anywhere that I could positively recognize it as such. But yeah, I'm interested in it, but not in a colonial way.
Yeah, because that's what you are against, but you must clearly be willing, like you have stated, to bring this good practice to the rest of the world as much as possible. We must always want to give power to the people, and I think that there are potentials across, developing world, because I asked that question about carbon credits and offset, because that's where whole this thing's greenwashing is going on. And let me come to the question of greenwashing, because you have rightly alluded, to some of those practices just being greenwashing, elements of greenwashing. How do we stem greenwashing? What safeguards can we have? It's growing, and again, another power of the corporates, to derail our attention from the real issues, and just whitewash, gaslight. How do we address this, Paul, from your experience?
Well, you are the man on this subject, and I really admire your work. So I'll hesitantly say what I think about it, but knowing that you know a lot about it. From what I've encountered a great deal in what I do. And so I very much appreciate its importance. It's hugely important as an issue, particularly because it is so much greenwashing is offshored. So they commit the fraud here and they dump the waste somewhere else. And it's laundering, right? It's laundering. It's essentially the laundering of violence. It's taking violence and it's washing it into away into some other place and burying it somewhere else. It is commercial fraud. So it's defrauding the consumer, and then committing a second crime of so-called externality, which is to externalize the damage somewhere else. So you defraud the customer, externalize the damage, and so it's double crime, and it should be treated as a crime. So greenwashing should be treated as at a minimum commercial fraud, and beyond that should have criminal penalties for the impacts in wherever they occur. I think I mentioned to you when we last spoke that in my town, this is a widespread practice now. I mean, it's become a culture, and it's a culture of impunity because everyone's doing it. So there's kind of shared guilt that the waste streams that we have now in kitchen waste are incredible. Almost everything that goes into your kitchen garbage can is toxic. All of the packaging is toxic. It's no longer paper and glass and metal. It's plastic. It's perfluoroalkyl substances, forever chemicals, horribly. So that the landfills are filling up with toxic materials, and people know this, and so what are they doing? They're putting the waste on trains, and they're sending it to the New York border, sending it to South Carolina, and so it's becoming essentially ubiquitous criminal activity that is sanctioned by states, just overlooked and ignored. In the meantime, you have this incredible ubiquitousness of the toxins, right? It's building up in the environment, it's building up in the air, it's in the soil, it's in the water, and so it's not as though the exporting of the waste is actually protecting anyone. It's just delaying the impact on everyone, and so the damage is profound, and I think should be treated as criminal. But I think it also should cause reflection about just the idea of self-labeling, that allowing a company to say that its product is sustainable or that it's natural or that it's organic even, is essentially state-sanctioned lying. And there are laws that allow that lie to occur. I mean, particularly in my field, I look at the laws that authorize the selling of green power using renewable energy certificates. And those laws specifically state that a seller of non-renewable energy, 1 megawatt hour of non-renewable energy, that purchases a certificate may market his energy as renewable. That's what it says. It says you can lie. If you hold it, it's a certificate to lie. And that sanction is it's criminal. So there's criminality in the law, in my view. And much of neoliberal policy has led us there because of its premise, which is we have to create markets. And to create a market, you have to lie, basically. You have to lie. You can't have a market in carbon without lying. And so you have to sanction the lie. And once the law is lying, that's a crisis of the state, right? When the law is lying, what's the law? What's the state? I mean, it isn't anything. There's no logic in the. There's no reason in the law. So the crisis already occurred. It occurred decades ago when these governments went this path, and I think it all has to be undone. We have to just undo it, and the law must not lie, and all this behavior it should be criminalized, and so you can't self-label. Any labeling that occurs has to be essentially regulated. It has to be regulated. You can't say that your product is anything unless it's been confirmed to be so. And and then I don't know. Beyond that, I mostly think people need to. It goes back to the state-sanctioned lie, but also then just all these market ideas, because it's really the market ideas and the idea of all these labels and all these protocols and regimes, trading regimes, and carbon trading systems and renewable energy certificate trading systems. And what is all this stuff? It's just a refusal of the government to do things and just offloading it to market participants and saying, you do it. And acting like that is a solution is clearly not a solution. And so that whole model of how government should behave is the cause of the problem. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that we don't really have another option, which is what I think a lot of the people that I associate with are more on the left. They sort of pretend, oh, well, let the central government do it. I remind them, I'm sorry, but you have to remember how we got here, which is that didn't work either. That's why they did this. That's why they did it. So we have to remember history here, which is that the central government was a disaster. It unloaded everything onto the market. That's a disaster. So therefore, what's next? And my view is that localization is next, that we can't go on this way. We can't just go back to 1950 with mega states doing everything. We have to learn from this, go to phase 3. And that is deconcentration, right, of the economy, decentralization of the government. And doesn't mean get rid of them. It's not a revolt. It's not a revolution. It's just we need to turn on the local and make it work, because that doesn't work. It's not going to work. I guess that's the general response to that question.
Wow. I mean, it's so tempting to keep asking more and more questions, because you've got so much to offload. But we need to wind down, Paul. And just before we take your final thoughts, there is this public information that we like to put out regarding opportunities in decarbonization. To our audiences, especially in the UK, net zero opportunities. So we'll usually at this point, take a short message, and come back to wind up the podcast with you.
Net zero doesn't have to be net loss. At Sustainability, we help businesses unlock clean energy solutions that cut costs, boost profits, and build brand pride. We directly connect you to opportunities for energy efficiency, product and process innovation, enhanced environmental stewardship, social value and corporate social responsibility, and much more. Contact us at hello@sustainability.co.uk or call 800 999 1340.
Over 30 years plus of, your life, your time, creating a noble model, of giving power to the people, political and economic power, and you are not tired yet. You are still pushing and pulling. You're still inviting, for people to come to you. You're still, open to go to people to replicate this elsewhere that, they're open to, So the question really, Paul, is what is it that you haven't done that you want to do for sustainability, for the climate, for the world, for nature, for humanity and society?
Thank you. Okay. I just completing a book called The Localist Manifesto, which tries to sort of lay out these ideas, this perspective, historical perspective on what's going back centuries, 4 or 5 centuries, the modern period, and we're thinking about the modern period, because I do think we're in one of these rare crisis points that can't be explained only in one century. That most of the what they call inflection points are 50 year, 100-year kind of things. I think we're in a 400, 500-year point here. This is really about modernity, and a system which has really been quite continuous during that period, but just reinventing itself. But it's crashing, and we're now, I think, at a point where something much more profound is changing. Partly it is true decolonization, right, where there's a loss of control by the West of the world situation. And so partly a reaction to that loss of control is this, I think, inquisitorial, paranoid cultural response, which we're in, which I call public madness in the book. Anyway, so I'm writing that book, which I hope, it's a very long book, and I know Americans don't really read much political theory, but maybe they will. I don't know. I wrote the book. Otherwise, for the past 10 years, I've been working on a new model of community choice aggregation, which we call CCA 3.0. California was 2.0, and that was essentially using the aggregation to issue the green bonds and build local regional generation, which they did. That was the $35 billion and all that. 1.0, which is the original version I wrote when I was 25 years old in Massachusetts, which was just buying green power. Before I understood all these problems with certificates and all this, I thought that would work. It didn't work, so I did 2.0 California. So California did result in building all these renewables, but it didn't result in completely changing energy, right? It just changed generation, in effect, the generation of power. It did change that dramatically. But generation of power is only part of the equation. If you look at carbon energy transition, its power is maybe a quarter of the cause of climate change, electricity generation per se. There's also the other United Nations definition of addressable carbon. There's power, there's heating fuels, there's vehicles, and there's waste, landfills, sewage. Those are the big causes of climate change. So I thought, well, I need to have a version of CCA that can capture all forms of carbon, but also looking at what happened with the 1.0 to 2.0 is a shift from a market-centered solution. 1.0 was just buying green power, which meant that the sellers of power were bundling everything together, organizing the product. They did all the work. The governments hardly did anything. 2.0, the governments got very involved. They had to put up their own credit and collateral. They had to directly negotiate with generators. They had delivery and compliance to get the power across the grid. They're doing everything, the billing. So it was government-centered. But what also happened there was they formed these bureaucratic entities that quickly became indifferent to democracy, to the people who were showing up at their meetings. They became kind of hostile and defensive toward the activists who'd done all the work to create those programs. And I realized that there's something anti-democratic inside of bureaucracy, just like there is inside of markets. And that's partly where I realized that these are false. They're false alternatives. They're not really opposing views. Bureaucracy and corporations are both very similar in a lot of ways. Just one is a government, the other one's a corporation, but they're very similar behavior, which is they tend to form monopolies. They tend to want to consolidate their position. They tend to regard critics as enemies and avoid any interference with their activity. So I thought, okay, well, that didn't work. So I want to do a new form CCA apart from capturing all of addressable carbon. I also want to shift the center from, instead of being the market or the government, center it on the energy user. So the new model, which I'm developing in New York, and I was approved last year by the state of New York to implement this, to become an administrator of CCA programs in New York. So I'm now working with the city and town of Ithaca, New York, which is where Cornell University is, to implement this program. And it's focused on using the aggregation to not just build local and regional renewables, but to build integrated, interoperable renewables at the building level. To have those assets be owned by the users in those buildings, whether they're renters or owners or whoever's using the energy or owns the building will own the systems, and to create a flexible mechanism so that people who are renters and can't do it on their building could buy shares in a system on a neighboring building and get equity benefits from that investment. So it would be universal eligibility. So anyone, even if they're poor, if they rent, if they're in public housing, they can't do anything in their home, they don't control the site where they live, but also businesses, the university, the municipality, everyone's included. And the municipality will also offer up shares on these facilities on their property. So it's trying to create centered on sharing, not sharing like Airbnb or sharing like that sort of thing, but real sharing, which is like car share, for example, sharing an electric vehicle, but also having the systems be interoperable so that, as I said before, the vehicle can power the building, can power the heating system, and not have these systems be separate. Anyway, that's 3.0, and we're just beginning to implement that in New York, and hope to have a pilot going, in the next year to have something to show for it. So yeah, I have another 5-10 years before I drop. So
Great. Good luck on that, Paul. And we'll be looking out for how that is panning out. Hopefully, it will be such a huge success like 2.0, CCA 2.0. What would be your final words to our audiences? What is that thing you'd like to say to them? Hey, look, just before you go, take this to heart. This is not politics. This is not economics. This is not markets. This is not the dialectics of both. But, as a person and for your community, for sustainability, for a greener planet, for a more humane humanity, and for a liberal society that is democratized. What should be your final words to our audience?
Thank you. Okay. Main thing is, I would say that the tendency of our time, I think, is to be driven sort of mad by the politics, but it's not really because of reality. It's just because of what's happened to those politics. And so to the extent that we're drawn into that, we're going to go crazy, and we'll decide things like, renewable energy is for the rich. It's elite. But that's just because of how they treated it. That's because of how both sides, those who promoted the renewable energy certificates and those who want to destroy wind farms, they're both thinking the same way ultimately, and both are unreal. And so it's so important to not be drawn into this, and to remember that we all know, and almost all people recognize that not just the ecology, but humanity, that are threatened, that not just threatened, but degraded, that we are being damaged right now, not just threatened to be damaged, but we are seeing damage to the human mind. We're seeing, in so many ways, a degradation occurring in our societies, a disintegration, and it's terrifying. So the main thing is that we don't want that to continue. We need to, and we can't rely on anyone really to stop that other than ourselves. When I say ourselves, I don't mean ourselves individually. I mean ourselves where we live, with our families, with our neighbors, with our towns, our municipalities. This is real. Everything else is a TV spectacle. It's on a screen. It's on your phone. It's entertainment. It's not serious. And the people that are delivering it to you are not serious, really. They view you as a market. They view you as a child. And so if you don't wish to just be the victim of this system, which really has its own tendency, and it clearly a destructive tendency, then you've got to refocus on where you live, what you can do locally, and not just as a personal choice that you do as an isolated individual, but in community, through local democracy, and recognize the importance, therefore, of that local democracy, even though it doesn't hold that importance right now. You go down there to the meetings, very often it'll be depressing, mediocre at best, or corrupt and sort of, evil. So it's not as though it's some utopia that you go and enter and it's perfect. It needs to be brought to life again, because it was the original place. It was the place that all people originally lived, in anywhere in the world. That's real life. We need to re-inhabit real life politically in order to inhabit it economically and emotionally, intellectually. That, I think, is my main statement.
Fascinating. So there you have it, guys. It's been an amazing conversation with Paul Fenn, president and founder of Local Power SSC based in Massachusetts, United States. We invite you to check out his profile, and we'll be sharing his link in bio on our page of the podcast as soon as it is up. We'll invite you also to show some love for humanity, society, and nature by sharing this podcast with your friends and all of your networks. Sustainability will help you find the spark in your business and community-related endeavors. Spark being sustainability strategy, policy, action plans, reporting, and communication. Please do shoot us an email via hello@sustainability, hello@sustainability.co.uk, and let's engage with your feedback, on this podcast, and we'll see how we can support each other for a more sustainable world. Until we come your way again with the next sustainable podcast, please do look after yourselves and your loved ones. Bye for now, and see you soon.